What is going on, everyone? Welcome to the Stan R. Mitchell Show. My name is Stan, and each week I cover politics, military news, and world events as clearly as I can without the outrage. The goal is simple: less tribalism, more facts, more context, and more grace. My goal isn't to tell you what to think, it's to help explain what's happening, lower the temperature, and remind us that we're all Americans before we are Republicans, Democrats, or Independents. There are 5 things that I believe that I try to keep in mind as I record each and every episode. First, America still has good people on the left and right. These are folks who would help you in a heartbeat, no matter which political party you belong to. The second thing I believe is that constant outrage is poisoning the country, and it's dividing us to a dangerous level. The third thing I believe is that you can disagree politically without hating each other. This seems pretty self-explanatory, but you wouldn't know it if you listen to most podcasts or news shows. The fourth thing I believe is that both parties have put the good of their party over the good of the country. There was a reason that George Washington, our first president, was opposed to political parties. He was correct then, and he is correct now. And the fifth and final thing that I believe is that real peace and hope won't come from politics alone. And thus, at the end of every episode, I spend a few minutes talking about my faith. You don't have to stay for that part if you don't want to. Goodness knows that there was much of my life when I would not have stayed for that part. So stick around for as long as you like. I'm happy you're here. Glad you're with me today. I know there's a lot of podcasts out there that you could be listening to right now, but you have decided to listen to this one, at least for the moment, so I'm very grateful for this fact. Just a quick administrative note, as I try to say most weeks. If you haven't signed up for the email list through Substack, it's free to do so. Please try to do that. I say that because it's a great way. I sometimes try to send out news supplements, and especially with everything happening in Iran, if something were to happen, I would love to have the opportunity to send you a free email and reach out to you to update you on those things. Again, it's free, or you can support the show at $5 per month, which you can do through that Substack link. You can find that in the episode notes. But let's get to this week and the news. In this episode, we are definitely going to talk about the situation in Iran some. I've tried to cover that extensively in previous episodes, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it tonight. There's a lot more unknowns than there are knowns. I'm not going to try to pretend to know things I don't know. What I am going to discuss at far greater length is what I see as the greatest threat to our country, because the situation in Iran is certainly a threat. But we're going to talk about the larger threat, arguably the largest threat to our country, and it is not China. I would argue it's not even AI. So we're going to talk about that. But before we do, can we begin the show by being real? Can we take off the mask? Can we be a real photo and not Insta-sham instead of Instagram? Can we just be completely transparent and real for a moment? Sometimes I'm not sure that we can in this day and age that we live. We all go to various vacation sites around the world. And you can even watch a young couple, maybe recently married, or maybe on a honeymoon, or maybe a young family with kids, and you can watch them angry and snapping at each other, or frustrated by the heat, or whatever the situation, or the lines to get there, or whatever it is, and then you see them go and get in front of whatever that background is that they traveled 600 miles to get there, for that photo, and you see them put on the smiles, you see them pull in the stomach and stand the certain way and do all the things to basically trick everyone else into thinking that their lives are perfect. And I heard someone say this week that we are inundated 24/7 with what this person called wealth porn. And I thought that was a pretty good term, wealth porn. And we think people have money. We don't realize they're in debt, unbelievable amounts of stress on the trip. We don't see that their families are wrecks. We just see the happy photos. We see that they're traveling when we're not. And we are just constantly bombarded with comparison and wealth porn, which isn't even true. And yet we just take it in, and we take it in, and we get more and more unhappy. We think everyone else is getting ahead. And in the old days, if you're my age, I'm 48, when someone would go on a trip, they couldn't even see the photos. They would take a bunch of photos and get the film developed. But those photos might be shown to a few family members or friends, maybe 15 or 30 people. And you only would see the very ones you were close to. But now, you've got 500 Facebook friends or 1,500, so you're constantly... Of course, these aren't even really friends. They're more like acquaintances, or they're really just people that their most liked photos are the ones when they're traveling or when people comment, and all you see are these bright parts of their lives that aren't even true. And so part of me is like, I don't even know if you can be real these days, but I don't know how not to be real. And so I'm going to be real. So I'm going to be honest with you, because this week I wasn't particularly excited to record the episode. And I think we all have those weeks where discouragement can creep in. And for me, it wasn't one big thing. It was just one of those weeks where you wonder whether what you're doing is making much of a difference. And maybe, if I'm being honest, maybe just as I discussed photos on Facebook and how those can make you sad, maybe I see growth of other podcast shows that is explosive, and just some of them can take off very quickly from almost nothing. And mine has been steady forever. And so sometimes it's like, why am I doing this? And as I was reflecting on that larger thought, and just reading as I always do, reading through the Bible, there were a couple of things that just jolted me this week. And so I'm going to start by reading those, because maybe you're in a place in your life where the size of the thing that you've been entrusted with, maybe it's the patrol area that you have as a police officer, maybe it's the business or department you're running, maybe it's the classroom or school that you're assigned to as a teacher. Maybe it's just the drudgery of parenting. Maybe you're just having one of those weeks. We all go through those seasons. And sometimes just showing up faithfully when no one seems to notice can seem a little challenging. I'm going to share the two passages that spoke to me, because I think, and I really, really, really hope that they will speak to you. The first one comes from the book of Isaiah. And this one might not speak to you as much as it did to me, because it's almost like it's written about this podcast. Now, the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament was written 700 years before the arrival of Jesus. So it was written in roughly by the author Isaiah, written roughly in 700 BC. It was written at a time when the kingdom of Israel was divided and was weak, was going through all kinds of internal divisions, which was inviting in, conquering neighbors. And of course, our own country has so many internal divisions. It's actually what I will talk about later in the episode. It's our greatest threat, are these internal divisions. And at a time when Israel faced its own real threats from external invasion, but the core problem was the country had turned away from God and faced all kinds of internal divisions, fighting each other. The kingdom was split. At that time, 700 years before the arrival of Jesus, Isaiah wrote in chapter 52, verse 7, "How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of the messenger who brings good news, the good news of peace and salvation, the news that the God of Israel reigns." I'll read it again. "How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of the messenger who brings good news, the good news of peace and salvation, the news that the God of Israel reigns." And I just came across that verse this week as I was, again, having this internal struggle. And I thought, that's literally what I try to do every week. In a country where everyone's trying to play the algorithm and stoke up fear, anger, and division, I do like my very best to bring good news of peace. Like, it's not as bad as they're saying. Obviously, every week I try to tamp it down. I try to just get people to breathe, see that what a wonderful country we live in, how things almost always work out. And I try to bring the good news of peace. And obviously, I try to end every episode by bringing the news that there is an eternal salvation should you choose. I try not to be overbearing with it, but I do bring it up. And that verse is just like, "How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of the messenger who brings good news, the good news of peace and salvation." And it made me realize that I clearly do not worship at the feet of any kind of algorithms or numbers or trying to monetize or do any of those things. Instead, I'm doing what I think the country needs and what I think, at least until I'm told otherwise, what I think I'm called to do. And that is to bring good news of peace. So that was the first thing I read, which just really helped me. Again, that one might not apply to you necessarily, but I think the second one potentially will. The second passage comes almost 700 plus years later in the book of John, toward the end of it, after Jesus has been crucified and he's returned. And this follows Simon Peter, who would end up being the head of the church, the rock upon which most, if not all, of Christianity was built. The strong person who throughout the New Testament is quick to speak, maybe a little too quick to speak, and he has promised and swore he would never deny Jesus, and he denies him 3 times. And of course, there's the famous story of the cock crows afterward. And many days later, I'm sure he's still dealing with shame. He and the other disciples have essentially given up. They think Jesus is gone, he's dead, and they're fishing. And Jesus has resurrected and returned. And he calls out to them as they're fishing. They've not caught anything. He tells them to throw the net out on the right-hand side of the boat. They'll catch some. Of course they do. They catch a ton. They catch so many that they can't even haul them in. And of course, John says to Peter, "It's the Lord." Simon Peter jumps in the water, heads to shore. And then later, the others stay with the boat. They pull the loaded net to the shore. They were about 100 yards from the shore, according to Scripture. They get there, they find breakfast waiting for them, fish cooking on a charcoal fire. Jesus is there, and they bring in these fish. Jesus says, "Come in, have breakfast." And after they finish breakfast, this incredible scene happens, where Jesus says to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Peter says, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." And Jesus said, "Then feed my lambs." Jesus repeats the question. Simon, think about how uncomfortable this must be. And he's saying his name. Simon, son of John, do you love me? Again, Peter answers, yes, Lord, you know I love you. Jesus says, then take care of my sheep. And then a third time he asks, Simon, son of John, do you love me? According to Scripture, John chapter 21, verse 17, reads, Peter was hurt that Jesus asked the question for a third time. He said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Jesus said, then feed my sheep. Now, what's remarkable about that is that earlier in the previous chapter, chapter 20, Jesus had already appeared to his disciples. And according to verse 22, Jesus had breathed on them and said, receive the Holy Spirit. So they've seen Jesus already return. They have received the Holy Spirit. And they have just a short time later returned to fishing. That's insane. They've seen Jesus rise from the dead. They've gotten the Holy Spirit. And they have again returned to fishing. So Jesus goes out to them again. They do the breakfast. He says that 3 times. Feed my sheep. Repeats it 3 times. And at that point, clearly, Peter gets it and goes on to do just incredible things for the faith and eventually is martyred for his faith. But the reason I share that, and the reason that I hope in some ways maybe it will speak to you, is that maybe you're in the same place I'm in and you are wondering whether what you're doing is making enough of a difference. You're not in that police precinct you want to be. You're not in that school you want to teach at. You're not in that business or that department or that role. And it can get a little frustrating and depressing sometimes. You can grow tired. The parenting can get exhausting. It can feel like you don't have any free time. But the Bible teaches us to not grow weary in well-doing. Speaking for myself, I have to remember that this might be the very podcast that reaches one person, that helps a veteran who is struggling. This might be the one episode that causes someone not to give up because of one little thing that I say. This might be the one episode that causes someone to mend a broken relationship with a family member or friend who allowed politics, such a silly thing as politics, to ruin decades worth of friendship and love and maybe family relations. We all know people who get too into politics and their relationships get fractured. And these are the things that I'm reminding myself of, but you've got to think about your own situation and how where you are currently at, I know the world uses the whole bloom where you're planted, but where you are currently at, if you believe what is taught through the holy word of God, where you are currently at is where you're supposed to be at least for this moment. Even if it doesn't feel that way, it's where you're supposed to be at. You were created for good works. You are where you're supposed to be at. And maybe tomorrow you get a promotion, maybe it all goes away, but maybe it doesn't for months or maybe even years. But you're where you're at. You're doing what you're supposed to be doing. And you should be of good cheer. And you should throw yourself into it. And so that's what I'm doing with tonight's episode. So I hope that in some way inspires you to keep pushing, to try harder, to dig deeper, to do even better. Because you're where you're supposed to be. And eventually those kids are going to grow up and you're going to miss them. Or you're going to be in a different department and you're going to actually miss the very place you're at right now, or the friendships and relationships you have wherever you're at right now, or that you're going to realize that the tedious work that you can't stand right now is actually forging you, forcing you to grow. It's building up your willpower and your grit, and it's going to pay dividends. So be of good cheer, lean harder into the harness, and keep pulling. That's what we got to do. Now, I'm not some kind of motivational speaker. I'm not Jocko Willink. And so help me if you don't know who Jocko Willink is. It will be very hard for me to forgive you. Look him up. And you're in luck that I am a man of severe faith, and I will forgive you. But I am not Jocko Willink. But if you need it, maybe you need to listen to Jocko Willink a little bit and find you some motivation, especially if you're not on a faith walk. Maybe you're like, Stan, all this spiritual stuff, I don't want to hear that right now. I get it. I used to be there. But regardless of where you're at in your season, find what you need to find to keep going, because there are people in your family, there are people in your community that are counting on you. You got to keep going. So we're going to keep going, and we're going to begin the episode by just a quick update on Iran. As you have probably heard earlier this week, the talks weren't really going anywhere. There were some small strikes back and forth, and then Iran attacked 4 different commercial ships. And it was at that point that President Trump said, you know what, we're done. He made some strong comments. Obviously, the strikes began to escalate. And so as we're recording this on Wednesday night, oil prices have started rising again, and Iran is launching ballistic missiles and drones and cruise missiles at American bases in the Middle East, and we are striking Iran. It's clearly hard to know where this goes. I don't think anyone truly knows. That's why I don't want to spend too long on it. I think some folks in the U.S. are hoping that we batter and pummel Iran hard enough that they will finally seriously come to the table for negotiations. But if you read media reports out there, there are divisions inside Iran. And even as they had their big funeral, I guess, celebration or commemoration, or ever how you want to name it or call it, for their former leader, their current president and prime minister were attacked and rocks were thrown at them. And I mean, it is clear that the Iranian military and the political leadership that runs the country, they're not on the same page. And there are some hardliners inside Iran that do not want to negotiate at all. And they were furious at those inside Iran who had negotiated. So there's just quite a balancing act going on inside Iran, not to mention the internal divisions that we have in our own country. Now, if you read some of the analysis about what the options are the same that they have been, and I've covered them extensively in previous episodes. President Trump says the peace deal is dead, and he had hoped, based on his long lifetime of experience of being in real estate, that Iran would care about economic benefits. And he's learning that they are more concerned with revolutionary ideology. And so, even though we were offering them incredible wealth through the tolls and fees that they could have charged, that apparently isn't enough for at least the hardliners. And so the options are, as we've talked about before, Trump could order our military to seize a key island inside the Gulf where Iran processes some of its, or most of its oil. There's real risk to doing that. That's that Karg Island, as you've probably heard folks talk about. Trump has threatened in the past to attack Iran's infrastructure, its water desalination plants. But Iran has said that if Trump does that it will do the same thing of striking Saudi Arabia and some of the other water desalination plants in the Middle East. And these are very valuable infrastructure that's hard to replace. Slight footnote, but many experts say that if Trump did this, by the way, it would be a war crime. I've seen some conservatives say that's not the case. I don't know what the truth is. I do tend to think it's a war crime. I don't think it would be right. I don't think it shows that we have military capability. It would be like being in a fist fight and maybe going for someone's eyes, or as men say, and as we know, kicking them where it hurts. It's just the kind of thing that if you've got to do that, it doesn't say a lot about your position of strength. But again, while I've read the case for why it could be illegal, I just don't see how people who you were telling to rise up 6 or 7 months ago, that you would go in and bomb the very things that give them life, especially when Iran's been dealing with a long-term lack of water situation involving a drought. I don't see how it's humane or right. But that is, I guess, in theory, on the table as one of the other options. One other thing he could do is he could continue to live in this world we've lived in the past few months, where it's neither war nor peace. And there's just skirmishes from time to time in the Persian Gulf, followed by some negotiations. At times, traffic flowing through the Strait of Hormuz. At other times, having it reduced. As one analyst said, the energy markets would probably adjust, and to some degree they kind of already have. Countries would probably try to find ways to build pipelines like across Saudi Arabia, also across Syria. We talked about this last week. The world would probably try to find, the world needs oil, and the world's going to find a way to get it out of there somehow, or more of it from somewhere else. There's just demand for it. But this will lead to a pretty hard shock, an economic shock for the world, because you just can't suddenly replace oil. And we've talked about this at length. And President Trump himself, about 3 weeks ago, said, we had 4 weeks of oil after it would have been bad. He's acknowledged that all these countries have used their strategic reserves. I'm hoping we got more oil out than I think we did. None of us truly know. I think many analysts thought oil prices would already be higher. But the reality is, the president doesn't have a ton of options. Elections are about 4 months away. Iran knows elections are about 4 months away. And already the Trump administration is having to ask Congress for $70 billion just to replenish and to fund the military because of the cost of these early operations against Iran. And every single week that cost rises because we can't reduce our troops in the area until we get this thing resolved. And Iran is in no rush to resolve it. I did forget, as a footnote, to mention that Trump could again embargo Iran. As he said, they created an embargo and then we embargoed them. We could go back to that. Some have believed back when it was originally done that it would lead to Iran's collapse. That didn't happen, and so there's no guarantee that doing so would lead to any economic collapse. But if there's one thing that I feel absolutely 1,000% sure of, it's that those folks who many months ago said time was on America's side, who said time was on Trump's side, who said that Iran was losing 400 to 500 million per day, and they would at some point fold. They would fall like a deck of stacked cards if we could just hold out for another week or two. It is clear that those people were wrong. Time is on Iran's side. Maybe they're being propped up by the Chinese or the Russians, other countries perhaps that aren't too happy with the United States. Maybe there's not enough world pressure. We can put lots of maybes, but no one can look at the calendar right now and say that time is on Trump's side, because it is not on his side. The political realities are here, and Iran is going to extend this out as long as they possibly can. It reminds me, I think it was in the end of March, maybe early April. I've done a lot of episodes, but even at that point, people were trying to role play or game plan the end of it. And I remember saying then, there's no guarantee that when we stop, they stop. That's not how a fight works. I've been in some fights. I've seen a ton of fights. You can win, you can think you've won, but if that other person is not done fighting, unless the cops show up and put them in handcuffs, like, the fight isn't over. And they might pick up a weapon, or they might go get buddies, or they might just hold off for a bit, but they might come for you later. But, it takes two to end a fight. And when one person says it's done, that does not mean it's done. No fight has ever ended because one person said it was done. It goes on until the pain is bad enough, or until it's reconciled, or in the case of war, until there's some type of real negotiations and peace plan, and both sides have either gotten some of their objectives or realized they can't get their objectives. Or if it's a fight between two people, you kind of get the anger out of each other. You fight, you realize it's done. But one person doesn't get to stop at any time, and it doesn't end then. Both people get a say on when it ends. And it's clear that in Iran, they're not ready for it to end. And so, as I said earlier, some Americans, some analysts, especially on the far right, they hope that the United States will punish Iran enough that they will come to the table, that they realize that they cannot go on, that this is such a one-sided fight. But as I've said in some previous episodes, based on the number of weapons that Iran has dug out of tunnels and all, there is a chance that they might overwhelm our air defenses again and hit our allied countries enough to where they are telling us we must stop. We must withdraw. I don't know. We don't know the stuff that's going on behind the scenes. We don't know how much additional defensive capabilities the United States has moved in. We know we moved in a lot. I'm confident we have, probably using the power of the purse, we have probably used lots of money to convince some of these countries to let us use their bases to continue attacks and defensive operations. That's what our country has done for a long time. And so maybe we've rearranged some of those countries that said we couldn't operate out of their countries, out of their airspace. We don't know what all the United States has done in the past 30 to 45 days to get ready for this next round, but we're clearly in the next round of fighting, and so we'll just see how it goes. If you are the praying type, you should consider, and I almost beg of you, you should pray for our troops because they face danger. If you are one of those troops, sailors, Marines, etc. out there, I wish and pray for you to have strength, to be alert, to be strong, and to know that the American people appreciate what you're doing. I know what it's like to be over there and feel like people aren't paying attention, to realize that the American people have a very short attention span, to feel like what you're doing is not that important. But what you're doing is very important, and the American people appreciate it. So be sharp, be alert, study your materials, sharpen the sword when you're not on duty or not on alert. Be as prepared as you can possibly be. I know that even though we are the best equipped military force in the world, I know your gear's not that great. I know what it's like to go into Albania with a rifle that wasn't even mine, that I had never even gotten to fire because mine was being worked on, serviced. So I went into a foreign country with a weapon that wasn't even BZO'd or battle zeroed for me. I wasn't even sure how the thing would shoot, what direction. It was a air winger's rifle, and I'm sure he probably wasn't real happy that some grunt he didn't even know took his weapon into another place and into the rain for days. And anyway, I know the challenges that you face, and I know the American people couldn't possibly believe half of the stuff going on with your gear, or how old the helicopters are, or what are the problems with your tanks or your air defense systems. The American people have no idea how bad it probably really is. But I also know that your ingenuity, your courage, your teamwork, and your drive, I know all of those things are unbeatable. And so have confidence in your leaders. If you're anything like me, I hate not knowing what's going on. I know you don't know what's going on. I know they never told us what's going on. I know there were many times I was given orders that made no sense. Orders that infuriated me. Orders that I thought put my literal life in jeopardy. One of these days I'll talk about a time that we were loaded on buses inside Albania probably. But at any rate, I know you're going through that stuff. Just know that the American people appreciate it. And if you are not a person of faith, maybe just say a prayer to God. It is a dangerous time and place you live in. And I know what it's like to be 18 or 19 or 20 in a dangerous foreign country. And you kind of think you're bulletproof. And you always think it will never happen to you. But it's dangerous. So trust in a higher power. Listen to words of wisdom. And also don't act rashly. Don't be too trigger happy. Don't make mistakes that could lead to long-term consequences that you regret for the rest of your life. All of that stuff crammed in. Listen to your leaders. You guys got this. We are proud of you. All right, we're going to take a break, but when we come back, we'll talk about the biggest threat for America. Quick reminder, if this show's been helpful, one of the best ways to support it is simple. Share it with someone you trust, or leave a review wherever you listen. Word of mouth still matters most. You can also follow or subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And if you want to go a step further, there are support options in the show notes. A small monthly subscription is one option, or you can even do a one-time gift. Either way, I'm grateful you're here. Appreciate you guys sticking around. So I was thinking this week about the Supreme Court decision last week about birthright citizenship, and there are folks on the right saying, we just need a couple of more votes on the Supreme Court. They are adamant about getting rid of birthright citizenship, and folks on the left and maybe arguably the middle are like, hey, this is what makes America America. And I thought about doing a long section on that. But it is just such a complicated topic to really bring in all the various views and to really bring in the 200 plus years of history, and we've gotten parts of this very wrong. I mean, besides the slavery issue, we didn't even grant Native Americans or Indians citizenship until like 1920 something, and they were here before us. So there's a lot to bring in on that, and I thought about pulling all of that together. But I was fortunate that one of our listeners, and actually I'm blessed to say he's one of the paid subscribers, is comfortable with me just identifying him as John from the Maine Woods, sent in a comment that I think covers part of what I would have wanted to say. And so I'm going to mention that comment, and then I'll get into the greatest threat this country faces. But his comment was good, and I think it covers, again, it does a good job covering something that I did miss last week when I had a section called What the U.S. Got Right, where we were talking about the 250th birthday of this beautiful country. And if you did not listen to that, I'm not going to recap it. Just go listen to last week's episode. Just jump to that timestamp. That's why I put timestamps in there. But John from the Maine Woods said this: one major thing you omit from your list of what the U.S. got right is the way with the Statue of Liberty, and especially during and after World War II, we, meaning the United States, we attracted and encouraged the best scientists, artists, musicians, doctors, thinkers, and entrepreneurs to come to the U.S. and participate, contribute, and benefit our country. World War II, similarly, sorry, I can barely say that word, had Americans, including African Americans, in the integrated military, directly experiencing the way other cultures organized their civil and political affairs. Because of this, the period after World War II saw the most revolutionary changes in technology, arts, and civil rights, and the creations of businesses and institutions that literally changed the world. During the 1960s, we celebrated people who earned engineering degrees, studied medicine, Star Trek, and the moonshot. And then he says, ironically, this is what the conservatives seem most interested in tearing down. And I thought I would play a clip from President Ronald Reagan. And I'm playing this because I just want folks to see how far those on the far right have gone. I mean, Ronald Reagan would not even be welcomed in the Republican Party right now. Certainly not in MAGA, in my opinion. And I think after you hear this clip, you'll be like, yeah, it's kind of crazy we've drifted that far. And I know, I hear you out there on the right that there are these candidates on the far left, the DSA, and some of them don't even want a police force, and just some of the comments that they've made and some of the policies they're pushing. Although it is a small minority of the Democratic Party, they are winning some elections, so I know there's extremes on the left and there are extremes on the right. But I just want to play this clip from Ronald Reagan because it will show you how far even the right has drifted. And this is why I regularly say that I am unashamedly a centrist. I think both parties have, frankly, almost lost their ever-loving collective mind. But listen to this clip from Ronald Reagan.
You can go to live in France, but you cannot become a Frenchman. You can go to live in Germany or Turkey or Japan, but you cannot become a German, a Turk, or Japanese. But anyone from any corner of the earth can come to live in America and become an American. Yes, the torch of Lady Liberty symbolizes our freedom and represents our heritage, the compact with our parents, our grandparents, and our ancestors. It is that lady who gives us our great and special place in the world. For it's the great life force of each generation of new Americans that guarantees that America's triumph shall continue unsurpassed into the next century and beyond. Other countries may seek to compete with us, but in one vital area, as a beacon of freedom and opportunity that draws the people of the world, no country on earth comes close. This, I believe, is one of the most important sources of America's greatness. We lead the world because, unique among nations, we draw our people, our strength, from every country and every corner of the world. And by doing so, we continuously renew and enrich our nation. While other countries cling to the stale past, here in America, we breathe life into dreams, we create the future, and the world follows us into tomorrow. Thanks to each wave of new arrivals to this land of opportunity, we're a nation forever young, forever bursting with energy and new ideas, and always on the cutting edge, always leading the world to the next frontier. This quality is vital to our future as a nation. If we ever closed the door to new Americans, our leadership in the world would soon be lost.
Again, that was President Ronald Reagan. And I know there are folks on the right who say, yeah, but, they throw out there's some crazy scenarios of what if China did this, or China sending folks to Guam to have babies and they're getting U.S. citizenship, and they'll throw out stories about their large numbers of Somalis in certain parts of Michigan, and they're not learning English, and they're committing lots of fraud, and, demonizing a certain group of people is about as American as America is. We've demonized Irish, we demonized Italians, Protestants demonized Catholics. For a long time, Catholics couldn't even hold office in many states. None of this is new. But I get that in some ways, these days it's a little different. And I know this is a national conversation that will have to be had between some on the left who think we should have open borders / no borders, which is clearly too extreme, to those on the far right who say American ethnicity is, let's be honest, basically a white heritage. Which, if you look at the number of even Germans and Italians, if you look at the number of Japanese who, even during World War II, fought for this country, if you look at the number of Latinos or Hispanics who have fought for this country, people who came here without even citizenship. I served with Marines who didn't even have citizenship, and they were here serving their country that they wanted to move to and be a part of. If you look at the number of even blacks who did not have full rights during World War II or even during the Vietnam War, and they served this country valiantly, it is a very extreme position that some on the far right are taking when they start to discuss skin color. Should there be conversations about assimilation? Yes. Should there be conversations about shared values, learning our country's history, agreeing that if you're going to come here, you're going to buy into our values and our freedoms, and that you will sacrifice to build up and defend and protect this country? Yes, 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 to all of those things. But when you start to say it's about a color, when you start to say it's about a religion, study our country's founding. People came here to get away from state religion. It is so challenging to even define. What would, to my Christian friends who want a Christian government, they would just like to see a Christian, what if it was progressive Christian? You wouldn't support that. I don't think anyone who is a person of faith, we don't want our government telling us what or who or how to worship. One of the things that makes this country great is its freedom. So some of those on the far right, they're going down and thinking about and talking aloud about some dangerous roads, paths, and ideas that I don't think they fully thought through. I would respectfully say that. And I would likewise say that those on the far left have not fully thought through some of the potential consequences of not looking at what number can we allow in safely. What conversations should we be having about what their ideas are for why they're coming, what their dreams are, etc. We do have a Western Christian-based ideas of freedom and liberty, and there's just some things that have almost been born into this rebellious American character that in some ways makes us so great and so unique. And so there are those on the left who need to have some open and honest conversations about this as well. I mean, even as I speak right now, on the left, there's a Democratic nominee for governor, Francesca Hong, who in 2021 said police exist to uphold white supremacy and that they should be abolished. And more recently, said in a perfect world, there would be a world without prisons. I mean, that is... I get it, it's utopian, I guess, but it's certainly not much common sense. There have to be consequences to actions. There has to be the threat of law and the rule of law. Just from a faith perspective, sin has consequences. You can't have folks who can go out and steal or murder or whatnot and not face consequences. And I know, I hear you out there, you can say, well, the policing was too aggressive against minorities, or stop and frisk, or this or that, or some of the drug charges, etc. There's certainly truth on some of those things, but there's also realities that some of the folks have committed multiple crimes. And there are just some folks who need to be punished for their assaults and terrible things they have done to society. Consequences are a biblical concept that go all the way back to the Old Testament, from what originally began as an eye for an eye, and there were rules for theft, and there must be rules, and there must be consequences. And, as people on the left say, those consequences should apply to the very rich, to the billionaires and higher, who seem to skirt the law, to the white-collar criminals that evade even rudimentary audits from the IRS or paying their taxes, who use their money to bully the poor and the unorganized. That's why I, again, lean toward the middle, because that's generally where sanity lies. But I wanted to avoid this much larger conversation, which I ended up getting dragged into a bit anyway, although I hope it did kind of get your minds thinking a little bit. And I wanted to talk about the greater threat to America. And let's be clear just how divided we are. Even with the two-party system, in both parties, the parties are tearing apart and splitting and fighting for control. On the right, you could argue that there's a divide between nationalism versus internationalism. Or you could call it restraint versus global leadership. On one side, you got people who are America first, or favoring a restraint. They want to stop trying to remake the world. They want to avoid new wars. They want to spend money on a border instead of defending other countries. They want to put manufacturing, immigration, and American workers first. They are skeptical of NATO commitments, foreign aid. And some of these leading voices include J.D. Vance, Tucker Carlson, Steve Bannon, many younger conservatives. And then there's the other side, the Reagan-type Republican, some of the hawkish conservatives. This group believes that American power prevents larger wars, that weakness invites aggression, that supporting allies is cheaper than fighting bigger wars later on, that countries such as China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea should be actively contained. Some of these leading voices include Lindsey Graham, Tom Cotton, many of the traditional national security conservatives, thinkers influenced by the Reagan era. And then there's Ukraine and how that splits the right. On one side, you've got people saying if Europe cares so much, Europe should pay. Europe should bear the brunt. On the other side, you got people saying if Russia wins, China notices, Iran notices, and ultimately America will pay a much higher price. I put myself in that group. Then there's even the divide over Israel. Got some on the right that are strongly pro-Israel, But that newer part is saying, why are we funding Israel? Why are we always involved? Is every conflict America's responsibility? These are big issues on the right. And the left is facing its own big fight. The divide on the left, you could describe it as progressivism versus liberalism, or maybe the activist left versus institutional left. And this progressive activist left, they emphasize things such as structural inequality and systemic injustice. They're big talking about identity, race, gender, sexuality. These are like a major thing that they view politics through. They want aggressive action on climate change, expand the welfare state. They're skeptical of capitalism. They see cultural change as just as important as policy change. And they're not afraid or ashamed to say that they're all about confrontational activism. These are people that are generally led by folks like Bernie Sanders, AOC, and others. And then there's a group on the left, the more moderate wing, they typically you could say they believe in capitalism with regulation. They believe in gradual reform rather than sweeping change. They're good with strong institutions. They're all about coalition building. They're okay with winning elections if it requires compromise. They're big on international alliances. They're happy with incremental policy improvements. This includes leaders such as Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi. There's some longtime Democratic governors and senators, And so again, on the left, there's this philosophical split about what is America. One side, the progressive side, says many American institutions were built on unjust foundations, and they require more than just a fundamental change. While the other side says America has serious flaws, but its institutions can be reformed. You could also see this conflict on the left as one side, the activist side, the progressive side, saying that race, gender, sexuality, other identities deserve equal or greater attention because these groups experience society differently. It's a fairness and equity issue for them. Whereas the more moderate side would say that politics should primarily focus on working class economic issues. And they argue that some of these gender identities have cost them close elections. And so the left has its own battle to try to figure out which side will emerge, same as the right. And all of this, these enormous divisions on both sides, even within their own party of our two-party system, and this is without me going into the Green Party or any of the Libertarian, and I could really divide it out even more than that. But these wide divisions, even within both parties, are a part of what I want to talk about as the greatest threat to America. And I'm going to break this answer up into two sections. The first section is just from a political standpoint. I think it's pretty strong, structurally sound. Don't think you can really disagree with the points I'm going to make from a political standpoint. And then I have to, because I am a person of faith, talk about a biblical point of view. I understand you can disagree with that, and I don't expect everyone to agree with that. I don't expect very many to agree with that, honestly. But let's just start from a political standpoint, because I think everyone's going to agree with this. And on the list of threats to America, Iran is quite far down that list. I would say it doesn't even make the top 5 or 10. Now, you could probably put China up there. There's definitely some threat from AI. You could definitely put our national debt up there, especially when you consider how rarely do we talk about the debt, the national debt. And even those on the left will, they have healthcare plans and other ways of trying to lift people up through the state. State being a smaller word for the federal government in most instances, not actually the small states, but just through the state, through the government. And on the right, every time, I was raised as a budget hawk, and I always wanted to pay down the debt, but every time the right gets in power, they do tax cuts, and they blow up the deficit even worse. And they say, oh, you can't tax these billionaires too much, or they'll leave, or they'll flee, or they won't produce as many jobs or incomes. And the right does not seem to care at all about the debt anymore. And so really, both the left and the right seem to barely care about the debt. Almost no one's talking about it. And so I think you could make a pretty strong argument that realistically, our debt is one of our greatest threats. But I'm going to put something higher than that. I think you could likewise make a pretty strong case that China is our most significant strategic competitor, not because they could potentially invade us, but because they compete economically, technologically, militarily, diplomatically. They've made unbelievable inroads diplomatically because we've done a great job of, frustrating and upsetting and angering our American allies under the Trump administration. But China is making some strong inroads, even though they do have some real problems of their own, especially with their population and their demographics. But they have some advantages, and having an authoritarian government, they definitely have some things going for them. So I wouldn't totally mark them out, but I'm also not putting them at the top. Clearly, I could also talk about the threat of AI. There's some pretty scary articles about that, but I don't really see that as the threat level. I see that in some way it's amazing and it's going to do some things and it's going to displace and it's also going to lead to some jobs. And I've gone from some level of concern and fear of that to realizing that I think it's overstated, the threat from AI. I'm going to avoid talking about that for the next 5 or 10 minutes because I've certainly read a ton and listened to a bazillion podcasts about it. I don't want to go down that road. I want to talk about what I do think is the greatest threat for this country. And that is, we are losing our social cohesion. Or you could say that we are experiencing a great erosion of America's social fabric. Or you could say it's fraying. Ever how you want to describe it. This is something, and I laid out the two parties and how divided they are, because it shows just, I know that there have been times in the past where the parties have been divided, but it is nasty out there. It is ugly out there. And if you look at just what is happening, you will see that our internal divisions are being fed by a lot of things. A lot of things. First, a loss of trust. Americans increasingly distrust almost every institution. We don't trust the government. We don't trust the media. We don't trust schools or universities. We don't trust our churches. We don't trust our corporations. And we certainly don't trust each other. And while a democracy or a constitutional republic, if you want to use that line, while we can survive disagreement, it is very hard to survive when people no longer believe elections are legitimate, when people believe news can't be trusted, when people feel that their neighbors are not acting in good faith. That loss of trust is scary. You can also talk about, which I set this up, political tribalism. That many folks no longer see political opponents as simply wrong. They see them as enemies. And if you study history, that's historically a dangerous thing to do. Because countries don't usually collapse because they disagree. They collapse when they stop seeing each other as members of the same nation. And this is something that the long-time listeners know I've brought up numerous times, but if you look at Yugoslavia and how it broke apart, and it was more than just ethnicity and religion. These are the things that concern me. But again, political tribalism, when you stop seeing other people as members of the same nation, that's a scary thing. At the same time, cultural fragmentation is another thing. Or if you think about the media silos that we live in, Americans increasingly, we don't share the same stories. We don't share the same sources of information. We don't even have the same definitions of basic concepts. And so I mentioned this a bit earlier, but when you don't have a shared identity, it's very challenging to have people effectively live together in a cohesive environment because everyone has different realities as they see it. And then throw in this little point. Our declining civic engagement. To have a healthy society, you need people who participate in local government, people who participate in churches. If you're not religious, people who participate in volunteer organizations, people who volunteer time at their schools, even if they're not a teacher, people who do things in their neighborhoods. And when those institutions weaken, polarization begins to fill the vacuum. Now I hear you out there and you're like, Stan, like what's the fix? Because that's all scary stuff. And I gotta say, this is the kind of stuff that constantly terrifies me. That's why I've been shouting into the void for the last 3 or 4 years that we have to come together, that we have to lower the temperature. It's one of the main reasons I do this podcast. There was a short time where when I initially launched it, I just wanted to cover the military, and I've been very transparent that it was about ambition, it was about building up my name and selling books. And then I had my come to Jesus moment for a second time and reactivated my faith and thought about just stopping the podcast. And then later came to realize that I wanted to try to unify the country and I wanted to talk about my faith. And it isn't about Stan anymore. And I think anyone who listens to this realizes this isn't about Stan anymore. So I'm going to get into the solution in just a second, but I have to mention, just from a Christian perspective, this is the part that I said, this is the biblical point of view that I don't expect many people to agree with. But from a biblical point of view, when a people become too proud, when they move away from justice, when they begin to worship idols or idolatry, when they become too accustomed to and a part of corruption, when they forget God, inevitably some type of national decline follows, or the society falls apart. Because when you don't put others above you, when you don't serve others, when you don't forgive people of their offenses or their sins, or when they've shorted you or hurt you, when you're not about peace, when you are greedy, when you're all the things that the faith that Jesus came and exemplified, when you are not living in that way, you are headed toward consequences. And so I do just have to point out that I think one of the greatest threats, and probably from just a faith perspective, the greatest threat to this country, the reason we're so divided, is because we no longer put God first. We have not submitted to God. We think we can handle everything. We think we don't even need Him. We don't even believe in Him. One of the big biblical truths, especially inside churches, is that there's lots of discussion in the New Testament, especially about division inside a church and preventing division and keeping it from happening and how to deal with it when it happens, because division is a scary thing inside a church. It leads to splits. It leads to churches dying. The church history on that is, you could talk about it for hours, but we see that with our country. And I literally laid it out, even with the political parties, the division on both sides. And if you took 100 Republicans and 100 Democrats, and you had 50 and 50 of each side of the two different parties that I basically laid out of the fight for that party, and you said, hey, is it more important to come together and let the Republicans win or the Democrats win than the other side? They would be like, yeah, absolutely. But they're so adamant about getting their way and that their way is right that one of the two parties will inevitably sabotage itself. It'll probably be the Republicans, but just because historical trends say that the party that's in power will lose out. So most likely it will be the Republican Party, but there is a chance that Democrats will push too progressive on some issues and make that less of a victory, or potentially put their chances of taking back the House and Senate at some level of risk. Now, again, so much is moving in their way that they would have to try really, really hard to mess this up. But we've seen them take very small issues, whether it's, gender or trans, or whether it's abolish the police. We've seen really outrageously far out positions that politically don't make sense. Now, you can say, well, from a justice standpoint or this or that, I get it. I know why people fight for it. I'm just saying, from a purely pragmatic, get someone elected standpoint, we've seen them go far out on issues that have cost them votes at a minimum. Even when they've won, it's cost them votes. So they could self-sabotage, but division is the thing that, besides just basic faith, division is something that the New Testament just hammers home, because division is deadly for organizations, for churches, and arguably for countries. So I'll leave the biblical point of view because I know that a lot of folks aren't there, and I don't want to be overbearing or pushy or any of those things. So back to the political side of the house. How do we fix this? How do we start to prevent and repair, prevent further erosion, repair wounds that have already been created past 10 or 20 years? How do we do that? How do we prevent this greatest threat, in my opinion? And it's funny, I was looking through some previous threats to the country, and you can go back to the 80s or so, like the Cold War. It was Russia, and then eventually in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, it was like Islamic terrorism, and then it's kind of China, and I think if you listen to this, debt is a serious thing, but I mean, that's the political divisions that we have are our greatest threats, and especially when foreign actors like China and North Korea and Iran and other countries can pour in millions, if not billions, in social media campaigns and bots and various ways of, they literally pour fuel on the fire of the various issues that divide Americans, whether it's police brutality, or I could make a list of like 10 things, and they go nuts on them and they make it far worse. And we're getting played to a large degree by foreign actors that I wish there was some way that our government would take more of a stance in. But the moment they do that, last time it was the far right, but it'll be the left or the right would say, well, you're affecting freedom of speech or this or that. And so maybe we just need to put our big boy pants on and we can deal with it. But regardless, plenty of evidence out there that foreign actors have used our free society and our freedoms of speech to magnify our divisions. Now, we are where we are. Supreme Court's ruled how it has. There's no real easy way to fix this stuff. So how do we fix it? How do we repair it? I tried to come up with just a few answers. And they're surprisingly simple. And they're also, not surprisingly, very difficult and hard to do. And it almost does a full circle with this podcast and why the podcast has not been growing, because no one wants to do these things. But how do we fix it? How do we repair and how do we prevent something really scary happening? Well, the first one is rebuild trust. This takes time. It would have to be earned, but we have to start trusting institutions, government, media, churches, businesses, universities, the very things I named earlier. These things need to become more transparent. They need to admit their mistakes. They need to demonstrate competence over time. And individuals inside of these various groups will play a role. Because if we assume the worst about everyone we disagree with, then the trust will keep eroding. Another way to fix it: reduce tribalism, which I preach about every single week. We need to think about what George Washington said. We need to get out of either party. Be in the middle. Vote for sanity. Sadly, most of us live in states like I live in Tennessee. It doesn't matter what I do. We're always going to be a red state for a very, very, very long time, if not forever. And probably whatever state you're in is either blue or red, and it's probably not going to change. Unless you're in about one of 7 states, or unless it's just an insanely big blue wave year because people are so tired of President Trump and his very loud, constant statements, social media presence, and ability to just irritate and try to be a part. He loves being a part of the news and he dominates it and he drives people crazy. But, barring all of that, reduce tribalism. Start to see that the old idea that, like, my political opponent is still my fellow American. Believe that they mean well. Believe that they're not the worst caricature that you have seen of them. And I'm bad about this. There will be someone who makes a good point that I agree with, and I'll be like, yeah, but 3 years ago this. Or, is this the same person who 5 years ago did that? And yet, if I looked at my own life and the things I say now compared to what I said 3 years ago before I started my faith walk again, someone could be like, Stan, 5 years ago you were like all about Buddhism. How do we know you're real about your current faith? Or you said this. Is he really a Christian if he said that 7 years ago? Or he used to believe that? We so tear people down and hold the very worst stuff against them. But one of the ways to fix it, reduce tribalism. I need to wrap up some of this stuff. I'm sorry I'm running long. Okay, next one. Recover our shared identity. I mean, basically everything I listed before, we need to do the flip of it, the flip side of it. Remind people we're on the same team, that we live in this wonderful freaking country and we are so blessed. Start looking at the good instead of the negative all the time. Start thinking about ways to serve this country. National service, like military or civilian, either or. Get involved in local communities. Get involved in churches or synagogues or youth sports or civic organizations. Get involved in your neighborhood association. Again, get involved in your schools. And then, obviously, increase civic participation. That's what a healthy republic needs. Volunteer, mentor youth, coach, serve on local boards, support local charities, attend town meetings, help your neighbors, put others first. This isn't like rocket science, but it's also not as much of a dopamine hit as getting on X or some social media channel like Threads or Blue Sky and just ripping somebody, tearing into your opponent, sharing a political joke. The solutions are out there. They're just hard to do. But we can do this. And ultimately, we must do this. And so my challenge is, do your own step this week in trying to do this. I would say share the podcast, but this might not be the most shareable episode. But you can start to be the change. And you can do one small step. You can reach out to that broken relationship that I mentioned earlier. Unsubscribe from the loudest voices that you follow, that I know you enjoy, and they're funny and they're aggressive and they stand up for your side, and you need to silence them. Find someone from the other side that's somewhat moderate, or maybe not crazy on that side, but follow someone from the other side. That does as much to flip your mind as anything. Get out of your media silo, follow someone from the other side, start thinking good or better of the person that you think is the enemy. All the things I mentioned. I'm not going to repeat them all, but I think I'm going to wrap up there. We'll skip the faith section this week because I talked about faith quite a bit throughout, and it's late, and I was a campus shepherd at my church tonight, and so I volunteered for 2 hours to protect people in a place where a lot of times we are under some level of threat. Regardless of your faith, lots of attacks on churches happen, so I'm not saying ours is any different. But it did give me less time, and the episode ran long. As Mark Twain says famously a couple 100 years ago, that if I'd had more time, I would have written a shorter letter. And if I had had more time tonight, I would have written and provided you with a shorter episode. So I apologize that with my full-time job and my volunteering this week, I did not get as much done as well as I could have. But I did the best I could. I hope you enjoyed it. Send me in some feedback. And I love all you guys. I love this country. And I hope we can continue to keep it going and pass it on to our kids and grandkids as it pretty much currently is. Maybe we can improve it some. But let's not tear it apart. Let's not divide it up or chop it up. Let's not burn it down. Let's not demonize the other side. I think we can do this. Thanks for joining me this week. If you'd like to support the work, there's a link in the episode notes. I always like to end each episode by saying that as you head into the coming days, try to be just a little kinder, both online and also out in the world. Remember that most Americans are good people, even if they vote differently than you do. Aim to be a little bit more disciplined this week than you were last week. Mentally, physically, and spiritually, raise the bar just a little. You don't have to be perfect. You just need to aim to be a little better than you were last week. When you fall short, forgive yourself quickly. Start again. Now, when the news discourages you, and I believe it will, because even on the best of weeks, the media is looking for bad news. But when the news discourages you, don't give up on this country. Try to remember that division weakens us. Unity strengthens us. This is wisdom, and it's also biblical. So guard what you feed your mind and your spirit. What you take in and absorb will shape what you become. Don't ingest poison. And that's mostly what cable news is. If you are a person of faith, make sure you make some time this week to spend time in your Bible. If you are not, try reading the Bible this week for the first time, or for the first time in a long time. You know what kind of results you're getting with what you've been doing. It might be time to try something new. Now, before we leave, I need to mention, on the off chance that you don't know, that I am an author in addition to being a podcaster. I write compelling stories that matter about courage, faith, and the fight for what's right. I've written a dozen books to date. They are military thrillers, police detective mysteries or whodunits, war literature, a western. One of them is even a motivational self-help book. And I've been fortunate to have sold more than 70,000 copies to date. So thank you if you're one of those who have purchased one of my books. All of my books are available for sale on Amazon, but if you go there, the list can be a little overwhelming. So people say, what book do you recommend, Stan? I would recommend one of my top-selling books called Little Man and the Dixon County War. It is a fast-moving Western. It has tons of action, and it has one of the best unexpected endings that you will ever see. In fact, I was blessed enough that at one point this book climbed as high as number 16 on the Amazon UK paid list in the United Kingdom, and that was with no outside marketing, no book publisher pushing it, nothing. That was word of mouth and people talking about it on social media. So that's the book I recommend when people say, Stan, what book should I start with? I should also say before we end the show that if you believe what I'm doing on this podcast matters in this moment for our country, you could partner with the mission to help keep the show independent and steady. You can do that through either a monthly or one-time gift, and there are several ways to support the show in the episode notes. No pressure to do so, just huge gratitude if you do. Until next time, stay hopeful, stay humble, and keep working to be the light in your corner of the world. You've been listening to the Stan R. Mitchell Show.